Argentina might be the most complex and rare anti-economic model of the world. Once the richest country in the world at the beginning of the 20th century, it was trapped in what economists call the middle income trap and never got out. To make things worse, historians and economists don't really agree on what happened. Some think that problems started with Juan Perón, a local populist leader that changed how politics was discussed in the country, while others believe that political instability and liberalism led to the destruction of the industrial base, where most people used to work. What they all agree on is that culture and politics play a major role in the never-ending stagnation of this country. There has been a continuous division on the long-term strategy of the country, with governments doing and undoing what previous administrations did. This behavior caused erratic results and transformed Argentina in a hybrid experiment that is difficult to comprehend for locals and foreigners. There are 4 periods in which Argentina's economy can be understood. The first starts with Argentina's independence and ends up with the start of the 2 world wars. In that period, the country grew based on 3 pillars: continuous European immigration, territorial and agricultural expansion in the Pampas, and, believe it or not, electoral fraud, in which the ruling party ensured the continuation of their hegemony and plans. Sure, they were corrupt, but they carried out policies similar of those that were present in the US and Europe. They tried to copy and adapt the model to a new country with equally European roots, as the natives were pushed to the Patagonia and the north. European immigrants received land for free or at a very cheap price, and in exchange they had to develop their own towns and cities. This led to colonies of different nationalities all over the country, resulting probably in the most diverse nation in the world. Christians, Jews, Muslims, they were all present in Argentina and shared the same soil peacefully. The colonies grew and became towns and cities with their own industries. In 1895 and up to the start of the 20th century, Argentina was considered the richest country on the globe measured by GDP per capita, as the Madison Project describes. However, political divisions regarding fraud and the appearance of new parties loomed over Argentina, as this model seemed as exclusive for people outside of the oligarchy that was concentrated in Buenos Aires, the capital of the country. The second period starts with these new divisions. The world entered in a phase in which the demand for commerce in general and agricultural products diminished rapidly, as violence was spreading all over the West. Argentina's customers started demanding other products instead of the country's primary goods, a phenomenon that led to the start of the economic stagnation. In this context, 2 new parties stood out: Radicales at first and Peronistas afterwards. There was also a third group comprised by the armed forces that would be decisive in the history of the country, as they carried out 6 coups d'état. After World War II, the Peronist movement led by Juan Perón, the former vice president of one of the military coups, won the elections in a landslide, based on a discourse similar to fascism, but renewed in terms of anti-imperialism, pro-workers, and very rooted on his image. Perón was a believer of economic planning and corporatism. As president, he supported workers' syndicalization and import substitution industrialization. But the main feature of his presidency was division. The country was fragmented between groups that wanted the 19th century model based on exports and perceived the government praxis as too violent, and those who supported Perón and his new policies. While the model of import substitution was successful at first, it was really hard for foreign investors to invest in the country as the state adopted a central role in the economy. Many companies were expropriated, agricultural sector's rents were confiscated in order to carry out social policies, and violence between groups grew rapidly. The second presidency of Juan Perón ended up with another coup. The third period features a cycle of coups and democratic rulers in which they start a certain set of policies and get overthrown by military action after losing the confidence of people. Argentina passed almost 20 years in doings and undoings. Radicales, military juntas, and Peronist guerrillas fought for power as Peronism was prohibited by law. It was not until 1973 that Perón came back to Argentina after one of his colleagues won the presidency. Perón would take his place, but would die soon after in 1974. As violence was spreading all over the country, a new military junta would take the presidency by force. Of course, economic stagnation continued as the country never had a defined course and marked the end of the third period. Argentina had been suffering from high inflation for decades until the 90s, when a new liberal economic model was adopted. The local currency was pegged to the US dollar, capital controls were repealed, and many privatizations were carried out. The country grew for the first time in decades, but terms of the trade worsened when the Asian crisis began, and Brazil, a commercial competitor, devalued its currency. This economic model that was fueled by debt and foreign flows of money blew up in 2001. Argentina defaulted its debt and started the biggest restructuring for a country in the history of capital markets. In the aftermath of the crisis, a new Peronist leader appeared, Néstor Kirchner. He won the elections with just 22% of the votes and quickly became a sensation in the middle and lower economic classes, as he managed to distribute the produce of the commodities boom of the start of the century. With the help of other Latin American leaders such as Lula da Silva from Brazil and Hugo Chavez from Venezuela that had taken similar approaches, Kirchner formed an alliance that marked the decade. When commodity prices started falling in 2011, many of the social programs of the previous decade became unsustainable, as fiscal deficits and current account deficits started a new cycle of foreign indebtedness in South America. After Kirchner's death, his wife, Cristina, took his place as the leader of the Peronist movement. The way in which both Kirchners governed brought back many of the divisions that were partially healed during the 90s. Mauricio Macri, a liberal challenger, appeared as a leader of the opposition and beat Cristina's candidate in 2015, Daniel Scioli, by 1%. Expectations for Macri were high. He was the first liberal candidate in almost 16 years. Markets soared and foreign capitals looking for emerging market assets entered the country. Macri saw this chance of taking relatively cheap debt as an opportunity to end Peronism once and for all by keeping and expanding social programs. But he failed big time as markets pressured emerging markets' currencies in 2018, which destroyed the value of Argentina's salaries and income in general. Macri lost the 2019 elections and a new Peronist government is now in charge. Alberto Fernandez, the new president, is trying to put an end to Argentina's infinite stagnation. But sadly, nothing seems to help this once rich country.